Mahatma Gandhi.
This is Akashvani. In the program Spotlight, now we bring you a discussion on Dr. S. Jaishankar addresses UN General Assembly, championing global unity amidst turmoil. The participants are Anil Wadhwa, former diplomat, and Nilova Choudhary, journalist.
It is amongst the most busy periods in the global diplomatic calendar, the opening weeks of the high-level segment of the United Nations General Assembly. External Affairs Minister Dr. S. Jaishankar has been in New York and Washington, meeting with his counterparts from a variety of other nations, including the quadrilateral of four democracies, before presenting India's statement at the UNGA yesterday. During this set of meetings and during his address, Dr. Jaishankar outlined India's priorities and stated how India has been both a leader as well as a bridge builder between the countries of the global south and the rest of the world. Ambassador Anil Wadhwa joins us today to walk us through the importance of this opening session of the 78th UN General Assembly and to explain to us why it is important for India to articulate India's national positions before the world. Good evening, Ambassador Wadhwa. Could you please tell us, first of all, why is participating in this high-level segment of the UN so important? And what has the External Affairs Minister essentially been attempting to do there?
So I think it's very important that countries participate in this high-level segment debate. And this offers a bird's-eye view of what the country is focusing on currently and where it wants to go in future. And of course, a lot of other countries use this platform also to voice their concerns. Sometimes it's also used for a slanging match with others, which in our case, we have always refrained from doing, except when the issue of Kashmir is raised by Pakistan in particular. So we reply, as a right of reply. But generally speaking, the Indian pronouncements at the UN General Assembly debate section have always been very comprehensive and give a picture about India's outlook on the world policies and dialogue and diplomacy. Now, in this case also, India's aim was to focus on the key concerns of the global south, not just the narrow interests of a few. And also, this is a time of deep north-south divide and east-west polarization. It was a chance for India to also highlight the achievements of the G20 summit in New Delhi, which showed diplomacy and dialogue as effective solutions. But there were other concepts that External Affairs Minister Jaishankar focused upon. I just quickly named just three of them. One, that India's role as a friend of the global south. And he offered examples of Vaccine Maitri Initiative, the International Solar Alliance, Coalition for Disaster Infrastructure, and engagement even in distant regions such as the Pacific Islands. Second is seen as the Vishwamitra, which is a push for collective endeavors and cooperation with diverse partners, which reflects India's evolution as Vishwamitra and is a defining characteristic of the emerging multilateral order, he said. And finally, the social welfare for all, where he linked India's external approach to its own internal development trajectory. And he said that we are seeking to demonstrate that social welfare need not be the sole prerogative of the developed world. So these were the four themes. And of course, in the process, he also reiterated India's claim to be a permanent member of the UN Security Council and reiterated the need for the UN to have a timeline for focusing on the reform of the United Nations, especially the Security Council.
It is actually quite incredible how well he articulates how countries look towards India now to not only act as a leader to sort of guide their paths, but how India has also emerged as a true proponent of the multilateral system that increasingly needs to come into being across the world. Now, in this context, it was interesting that he said things like the rapid growth of the Quad, a mechanism today so relevant to the Indo-Pacific that it is visible. It is equally apparent in the expansion of the BRICS grouping of independent-minded nations. Before Dr. Jaishankar's statement yesterday, he has also been meeting with a wide variety of other colleagues and leaders across the world to essentially present to them India's agenda as a country that cannot in any way now be left out of the center of global politics. Would that be a correct assessment?
Yes, absolutely. Because you mentioned about the Quad outreach, for instance. Now, he offered that as an example of India's distinct approach, which is cooperation with diverse partners. Because he did mention that from an era of non alignment, India had now evolved to that of Vishwamitra, which is reflected in its ability and its willingness, broad range of nations, and where necessary to harmonize those interests. And just now mentioned the growth of the Quad, terming it as really a relevant mechanism in the Indo-Pacific and the expansion of BRICS grouping of independent-minded nations. He also referred to, by the way, the emergence of the I2U2, which includes Israel, UAE, and the US, and also the India, Middle East, Europe Economic Corridor, plus the forging of the Global Biofuels Alliance. So what he said was that willingness to work in an open-minded manner on specific domains is now a defining characteristic of the emerging multipolar order. And in that context, he pointed out to India's role as a friend of the global south, first responder during natural disasters, and a support in its immediate neighborhood as well. So the Coalition for Disaster Resilient Infrastructure, the initiative on International Year of the Millets, development partnership with 78 countries across geographies, and the support that India has offered to the people of Turkey and Syria during emergency situations. All this figured with what India has done in assisting Sri Lanka during its severe economic crisis and also assisting distant regions such as the Pacific Islands. So this is important in terms of showcasing the role that India has assumed and what it sees for itself going forward.
It's also interesting that he said last week the United Nations assessed progress towards achieving the SDGs, the Sustainable Development Goals that they've set out. And he specifically talked about how within India, in the last 15 years, over 415 million people have been lifted out of poverty. And this progress has now moved to a higher level with ambitious socio-economic initiatives covering financial inclusion, food and nutrition, health and water supply, as well as energy and housing. So essentially, he is also showcasing India's sort of development trajectory as an example for the rest of the world. Would that again be a correct assessment?
Yes, I think he was quite clear that while speaking about SDGs, speaking of the issue of resource paucity in the global south, it was important that there was a need to improve the capacities of these countries. And also India's unique role as the largest contributor to meeting SDG targets and its success in halving the global multidimensional poverty index by half in 15 years and then lifting 400 million people out of poverty. So that was an example which showed that progress has now moved on to a higher level in India with some ambitious socio-economic initiatives, which, as you said, cover financial inclusion, food and nutrition, health and water supply, energy and housing. So what India is trying to do, he said, is to demonstrate that social welfare need not be a sole prerogative of the developed world. And in particular, he noted our digital delivery of public goods in facilitating the scaling up of programs so that enhances efficiency, combats corruption, and opens up mindsets, instills confidence, and inspires innovations. So then from there onwards, he went on to a critique of the unfairness of the international order. But the idea was to demonstrate that the countries of the global south need to progress themselves in order to be able to stand up to an unequal world.
Yeah, in fact, he was absolutely direct and fairly cutting about it, saying that we often advocate the promotion of a rules-based order. And from time to time, respect for the UN Charter is also invoked. But for all the talk, it is still a few nations who shape the agenda and seek to define the norms. And as he rightly said, this cannot go on indefinitely. But, sadly, every year around, whenever things seem to be moving in a certain direction and everybody is agreed that the United Nations Security Council certainly must be enlarged and it must become more inclusive. Countries like India cannot be left behind. At the end of the day, one gets the sense that is this just rhetoric that's happening amongst you air your ambitions everyone is agreeable, and then nothing really moves after that. And then again, things get spurred up next year at the time of the inaugural of the next session of the General Assembly. Is that a correct assessment again, or am I being overly critical?
No, I think the system of the United Nations is such that we haven't got down to negotiations on a text-based document. And we haven't gone down to that level because there is opposition, obviously, from the Coffee Club to the idea of expansion, because the members of the Coffee Club do not want certain countries to become permanent members of the UN Security Council. In the case of India, it has received no support whatsoever from China. In fact, China always played spoil sport, and it has in the Coffee Club allies like Pakistan and Turkey and others who also do not want, Pakistan, of course, does not want India to be there. Turkey doesn't want some other countries to be there. China does not want to be there. So they all have their pet peeves. And as long as that continues and there is no push to move over to text-based negotiations, this will all be a rhetorical exercise. And that's what we are witnessing year after year.
I think External Affairs Minister was extremely critical in certain ways, saying that when reality departs from rhetoric, we must have the courage to call it out. Without genuine solidarity, there can never be real trust. And again, he re-emphasized the fact that injustices like the kind of vaccine apartheid that the West has advocated for so many decades cannot recur. Climate action too cannot continue to witness an evasion of its historical responsibilities. And I think it was very interesting the fact that he said the power of markets should not be utilized to steer food and energy from the needy to only the wealthy. So again, the repeated emphasis on trying to make a more equitable world, that I think is India's national position articulated in a nutshell. Would that be a correct assessment?
Yes, absolutely. I think India is now coming out in a more forthright manner in articulating these concerns. The most important concern that India has is that the reform of the UN Security Council and the UN in general has not moved forward. And this, of course, the Prime Minister has also articulated on many occasions where he says that country with all the credentials, all the correct credentials, the country with the highest amount of population in the world, a country which has sound economic foundations, and a country which is playing a major role in world affairs cannot be a country which should be kept out of the UN Security Council. That's number one. And secondly, of course, there is this frustration, if you might call it that, at the lack of reform of the international institutions and leading to the movement on the reform of multilateralism, and of course, which is something which affects not just the India, but also the entire global South. This is also reflected in the non-fulfillment of promises of the developed world as contributors to meeting the mitigation of climate change in the global South, which has been promised time and again, but it has not materialized. So what India is trying to do is to highlight these issues before the UN General Assembly, and doing it in a much more forceful manner now than it used to earlier, because of the fact that it has all the right credentials, is just emerged out of its presidency of the G20, and is seen to be a country which is articulating the concerns of the global South.
In fact, it was also mentioned that during his meeting with the UN Secretary General, Mr. Guterres, in fact, thanked India for the positions that it has been articulating and for taking up. And Dr. Jaishankar thanked him for helping and sort of establish the role of multilateralism. Unfortunately, when that takes actual concrete shape is something that we will have to perhaps leave for another date in the future. But thank you so very much, Ambassador Wadhwa, for enlightening us about what this is all about and why it's important to be at the United Nations this week. Thank you.
Thank you.
You were listening to a discussion on Dr. S. Jaishankar addresses UN General Assembly, championing global unity amidst turmoil. The participants were Anil Wadhwa, former diplomat, and Nilova Choudhary, journalist. This program was produced and presented by the News Services Division of Akashvani. You can listen to it on a mobile app, News on AIR. This program is also available on our YouTube channel, News on AIR Official.